Okay, welcome everyone. This is the first event for the spring for the Safeguarding Democracy Project. I'm Rick Hasen. Very happy to see all of you in here and online. And I, of course, forgot the schedule for the rest of the events for the semester to share with you, but we send out enough emails that I'm sure you'll be able to figure it out. I can tell you that we're going to have another live event, as opposed to the rest that are online, about documentary proof of citizenship requirements for registering to vote. And among the speakers will be the Secretary of State of Arizona, Secretary Adrian Fontes. And Ben, do you recall the date? March 4th. March 4th, so you can mark your calendar. There'll be other online events, but that's one in person, so hopefully we'll see you there. Today, our topic is what's ahead for the next 4 years. Obviously, there's a lot of change going on. If you're like me, your phone keeps blowing up with lots of news alerts about changes going on in politics and in law. We've got a great panel featuring leading scholar, leading just completed election official, and leading journalist. Alphabetically, starting to my immediate right, Amy Gardner is now Washington editor.
White House editor.
White House editor for the Washington Post. She was a national reporter covering democracy. If you remember reading the story, I just want to find 11,780 votes. That is the story that appeared under her byline. She covered the 2010 midterms, the Tea Party revolution. She's a member of the Post team that won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for coverage of the January 6th 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. To my immediate left is Pam Karlan, who is co-director of the Supreme Court Litigation Clinic at Stanford Law School, one of the country's leading experts on election law, law of democracy, as well as lots of practical, real-world experience working for the United States Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, working with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, serving on the California Fair Political Practices Commission, and she's now a new co-reporter on a restatement project on constitutional torts. And to the far right here is Stephen Ritter. He is a senior practice fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and CEO of Republic Affairs, which provides crisis counseling services to pro-democracy entities and individuals. I'm going to want to ask you about that. But previously, until January 1st, I believe, he was the elected Republican Maricopa County Recorder, responsible for voter registration, early voting administration, and public recordings in Maricopa County. He is a JD MA from the University of Chicago, which we were just discussing. He's received many awards for his commitment to public service and democracy, including being named Arizonan of the Year in 2021 by the Arizona Republic. All right, so lots of change coming in terms of politics related to voting in elections, law related to voting elections, and election administration. So we're going to tackle each of these topics. I'm going to direct first a question to Amy, then to Pam, then to Stephen, and then open it up for a broader discussion, and then take the questions of people who are here in person. Unfortunately, we don't have the capability to do questions for people who are watching online today. So Amy, in the last Congress, the House passed something called the SAVE Act, which was a Republican-written piece of legislation that was going to impose new requirements for voter registration, including this documentary proof of citizenship. This has been named one of the priorities in the House. It was actually in the House organization bill. It says this is one of, I think, 12 pieces of legislation that can't be amended on the floor. When President Trump was out here last week with the wildfires, he was talking about voter ID in California as a trade for disaster relief. What should we expect from Congress? What should we expect from the new administration, both in terms of legislation and executive action?
So I think that there are a couple of different things to look for. Let's start with executive actions because it's actually something that the election integrity sector, meaning those who support Donald Trump and his interpretation of what happened in 2020 and want stricter voting laws to prevent the fraud that they have not proven has happened. They expected to see something on day one in that flurry of executive actions that we all saw on Monday, the 20th, and there wasn't anything. And it was actually cause for concern among some of my sources who I've spoken to, and I still stay in touch with them, even though I've gone to a new job these past few weeks. And so there's a little bit of concern that people don't even know who the person is inside the White House who would be the main sort of point of contact and person pushing this type of executive side action in the realm of voting. Although the flip side of that is that most of the changes that this sector want to see require legislation. So there's lots to talk about there. I will say one other thing about executive action, though, before I turn to legislation, and that is that one area that some people are quite concerned about seeing executive action on is what I'll call retribution. And the Post actually had a story this morning talking to election officials and prosecutors and other officials who have been targeted by either Trump or his allies, and who have said that these people should be prosecuted. And one of the things that I like to tell reporters to do when we're chasing these kinds of stories is, listen to his words, listen to what he says he's going to do, and also listen to his actions. So he said these people belong in jail. One of the first things that he did when he got into office for the second term was to fire all the people associated with the Jack Smith investigation. So this is a priority for him. The story that we wrote this morning is kind of alarming, but it's more about how these people who believe they could be targeted are preparing, like literally making contingency plans for somebody to take care of their small children, getting passports, having international available bank accounts. Like that's the kind of moment that some officials in election land believe that they're in right now. I actually think it would be great to hear from Stephen on this issue, since he was so in the trenches and so targeted by the election integrity folks in Arizona in 2020 and 2021.
Let's put integrity in quotes, please.
Yeah, I'm using that as their label. But so on to legislation. There's so much that the advocates in this space want to do. There's the Election Integrity Network, which is Cleta Mitchell's group. There's True the Vote, which is Catherine Engelbrecht's group. There's Public Interest Legal Foundation, which is J. Christian Adams's group. These are all groups that, want to be like holding the pen, writing the legislation. They're the ones who've been filing the lawsuits over these years, challenging voter reg and voting laws and all the things. So, and they want to do so much. They want to redo the motor voter law to get rid of the what's the phrase for the blackout period for removing ineligible voters or questionable challenge voters from voter rolls. They want to get rid of no excuses absentee voting. They want to create a federal law that requires, as Rick said, proof of citizenship when you register to vote and maybe when you vote. They want to impose a federal law that requires the states to have voter ID, which you saw with Trump's comments either in North Carolina or California on Friday. So, I mean, there's a lot that they want to do legislatively, and I think that is where we should focus a lot of our attention. One last point is that there's a double-edged sword in this realm for Trump. First of all, he's got a whole set of priorities that are coming first. We can see what they are: mass deportations, putting a freeze on all kinds of government spending, getting his cabinet confirmed. But second, I think that they want to keep the voter integrity, election integrity, quotations used, movement alive because it's actually politically beneficial. There is a segment of the Republican coalition that believes what Trump says about 2020, and it's an animating force to keep people engaged and voting and turning out for elections, kind of the way abortion has been for decades in this country. But there's a flip side, which is that some of these rules, some of these changes could actually make it harder for Republicans to vote too. And so I think that's one of the tensions that I'm going to be paying attention to as we go forward.
Let me just ask as a follow-up before I move on, to ask you about the prospects of anything that passes out of the House making it through the Senate. I think the only way legislation makes it through the Senate that does something not bipartisan on voting is if the filibuster goes away. Is that something that is in the cards in the next 2 to 4 years?
I'm certain that it's something that President Trump wants to see happen. Whether John Thune wants to see it happen is another question. I mean, there's a story that we want to do that I think it will be quite illuminating about this dynamic, which is, dear Mitch McConnell, welcome to the resistance. So like, you know, there are some dynamics in the Senate that are uncertain right now because McConnell has really decided to be outspoken about what he doesn't like that Trump is doing. And I think at the top of that list, obviously, is RFK Jr.'s appointment as a polio survivor. But anyway, I digress.
Thank you for that. Pam, let me come to you. Yesterday, it's like every day seems like a month right now, but yeah, I think it was yesterday, there was argument in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit over a very unusual contest in a judicial election in North Carolina over a Democrat has had the incumbent by, I think, a little over 700 votes, and the Republican who is behind is trying to get 60,000 votes thrown out. And the question for the Fourth Circuit is this technical one about whether this gets decided in the federal courts through removal or whether this goes back before the state Supreme Court that is deciding about its own membership. Do you see this as kind of a harbinger of what we should expect in the next 4 years? What are, in terms of voting rights and protecting democracy, what do you expect to see in the courts in the next 2 to 4 years?
Sure. So first of all, thanks so much for having me here. It's really great to be back at UCLA. And I want to thank Stephen because my 99-year-old father and my 89-year-old mother live in Maricopa County, and I was very worried about whether they had voted this time. And so I kept calling and saying, did you vote? Did you vote? And my mother finally said to me, yes, we did, and we were able to trace our mail ballots. We were able to track our ballots, and they've been received and counted. And so,
which sticker did they get?
I didn't ask.
Okay.
I didn't ask, but you know, it's one of these things that the ability for somebody like my dad, who has some mobility problems, to cast his ballot effectively is a major innovation that we've seen really over the last 10 years or so. I mean, the move to make it much easier for people to vote. So yeah, we're going to see a lot of back and forth between the federal and state courts, and I'll get to that in a moment. But when I think about like what are we going to see in the courts, the first question that I would ask is who's going to be bringing lawsuits? Let me just make a couple of observations about that. The first is that a lot of lawsuits, both under the Voting Rights Act, but also under UCAVA, which is the law that deals with voting by members of the military and overseas citizens, and the NVRA, which you've referred to already, the motor voter law, and like a lot of that litigation is brought by the federal government, by the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. And I think what we're going to see over the next 4 years is virtually nothing affirmative coming out of the voting section. There's already a freeze on new work. They have started to move people out of the voting section and into this sanctuary cities task force. The nominee for the head of the Civil Rights Division, Harmeet Dillon, is an election denier. And so if we see lawsuits coming out of the government, what I think we're going to see is enforcement of lawsuits that limit voting rather than that expand voting opportunities. Harmeet Dillon, when she was in private practice, filed a lawsuit alleging that California had violated the NVRA by failing adequately to verify people's citizenship before they went on the voting rolls. That lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, but I think you're going to see a lot of attempts to go after states for so-called list maintenance in various ways. And I think in addition to the suits that the Justice Department files, it's going to file amicus briefs or statements of interest supporting the groups that Rick's already talked about. So we're not going to see much of the kind of lawsuits that traditionally have been brought by both Democratic and Republican administrations. And I should say, for those of you who don't remember this all, because it occurred before you were born for many of you, but voting rights have been a bipartisan issue in Congress for generations. The 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act, which made it much easier to prove racial vote dilution, were in part the product of decisions made by Henry Hyde in the House of Representatives, who's also, by the way, for those of you who follow this, the Hyde Amendment that restricts abortion funding. He was in favor of voting rights. Bob Dole, who was a senator from Kansas, was the person who really shepherded large parts of the Voting Rights Act through in 1981-82. Jim Sensenbrenner in the House was extraordinary, from Wisconsin, was extraordinarily influential in getting the Voting Rights Act reauthorized in 2007. I represented the bipartisan leadership of the House Judiciary Committee twice in defending the parts of Section 5 that the Supreme Court ultimately struck down in Shelby County. So we're seeing a kind of sea change in the party's approach to voting rights, and I think that's worth saying. So second, what about private plaintiffs? Defendants in some of the cases, and some courts have picked up on Justice Gorsuch's suggestion in the Brnovich case that there's no private right of action at all under the Voting Rights Act for people who claim that they've either been denied the right to vote on account of race or that their votes have been diluted. I think this is absurd. There have been generations of cases brought by private parties, but I think we may well see the Supreme Court cutting back on the ability to bring these cases. So that's like the who, the private parties and the government. And then some major questions. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has been for a long time one of the major statutes that gets litigated. It's the statute that prohibits the use of voting practices or procedures, everything from restrictive registration laws to redistricting that has a discriminatory effect, a discriminatory result on racial and ethnic minority groups. But that, I think, may be changing. I don't want to step on their toes at all, but Bloomberg is doing a massive empirical study of what happened with the Voting Rights Act in the period, and voting rights lawsuits generally, in the period from 2017 to 2021, when the Supreme Court decided Brnovich, and then from 2021 forward. And what they found is a huge decrease in the number of Section 2 suits that are being brought. I think this is in part because most of the people who litigate these cases seriously are moving towards bringing them as intent claims, even though they don't technically have to prove intent, because they think those claims are both more likely to win if they can show that, and then more likely to stand up on appeal than results claims, where the appellate courts, particularly the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court, seem to be a little bit skeptical. So that's one thing. We just saw a Fifth Circuit en banc that reversed a long-standing, 40-year-old case, Campos, on whether you can bring a lawsuit challenging vote dilution on behalf of a coalition of minority groups. They're Black and Latino voters in Galveston, Texas. So we're seeing a huge decrease in the number of Voting Rights Act suits being brought because I think they're just harder to win. One thing that we are seeing a rise in, and it'll be interesting to see if this sustains itself over time, is challenges under the so-called materiality provision of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is a provision that basically says that no person acting under color of law, which essentially means no election official, can deny somebody the right to vote, and this is the language in the statute, because of an error or omission on any record or paper if the error or omission is not material in determining whether the person's entitled to vote. And I think the reason we're seeing a lot more of these lawsuits is both because a bunch of states have tightened their rules and because more and more people are voting by mail. And when you vote by mail, there are a lot more things you have to do to get your ballot counted that you have to take responsibility for than if you vote in person. If you vote in person, if you're able to sign in and get a ballot, you're past the materiality provision. But if you're getting the ballot at home and you're supposed to fill in a registration number that you may not have anymore, or you put the wrong date down, or you forget to sign something, or you don't put it into the inner ballot envelope that goes in the outer ballot envelope, there's this question, is your ballot going to be counted or not? And so there's a lot of materiality litigation going on. There were only 7 cases filed between 2017 and 2021, and there have been 23 filed since, which is a really interesting feature. On redistricting, well, over the next 4 years, we're kind of in the middle of a decennial period, so we're not seeing a lot of new plans being brought. But we are seeing, for example, some litigation involving particularly local jurisdictions. And as I said, I think intent is going to be a big issue in those cases. Where I think we're going to see some serious litigation is over who's going to be counted in the next census. The Biden administration had an executive order that said everybody gets counted, which has been the rule since 1790. You count everybody who's physically present in the jurisdiction and lives there. But the Trump administration, the last time around, wanted to get everybody counted, but then find out how many people were non-citizens in the count. This time around, I think they're going to try and move towards not counting those folks at all. And this goes back to something Amy said, which is it's not clear that this necessarily helps Republicans everywhere in the country, because in Texas, for example, or in California, that's going to cut down on the number of seats those states get, and the question of where that's going to be taken out of.
And federal aid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And where the districts are drawn.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I mean, is where they're going to lose, if Texas or California loses districts. In California, we have an independent redistricting commission. In Texas, the Republicans are going to try, I think, to take those all out of areas with high non-citizen populations. But this is a huge thing, and just to give you an example of the hugeness of this issue, I think go back to the Los Angeles County Commission case in the 90s, which is they drew the 5 county commission districts in Los Angeles, so they had essentially equal populations. But the most heavily Anglo district had twice as many voters in it as the most heavily Latino district, both because of age and because of citizenship. So I think, that's a place where we're going to see a lot of litigation, and all of the litigation that involves political unfairness is either going to have to be funneled into what I call a Trojan horse lawsuit, claiming it's a violation of one person, one vote or the like, or it's going to have to go to state court because the US Supreme Court has taken the federal courts out of that altogether. So I think that takes me back to where I started, which is we're going to see a lot more litigation in state courts, trying to use state constitutional provisions in places where the federal provisions aren't really available anymore.
Or state Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, or state voting rights acts. It'll be interesting to see what happens in New York, where an appellate division court struck down their state voting rights act. I think, the Court of Appeals is likely to reinstate it, but I just don't know.
That's a lot.
Yeah. I talk fast, I know.
No, thank you for that. And I think you've only scratched the surface in terms of what we might see in terms of
I
litigation.
was too fast and superficial.
Stephen, you were in the trenches in a way that we were not. You were getting messages that probably were not things you'd want to share with your family. Tell us about what your experience was like over the last few years and what you expect now that you have been replaced by someone who I think probably has a different view in terms of election integrity, in quotes, what this means for how elections are going to be run in Maricopa County and in other places in the country.
First, you are really popular. It's a little overwhelming how many alerts you get.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how you do that. I don't think I know as many people as have texted you in the last 15 minutes.
This is when you're White House editor the second week of the Trump administration.
Correct.
Yeah, there's that Jonathan Haidt thing, about how that's probably messing with your brain if you're getting all those text messages all the time.
Not probably.
Oh, okay. Let's see. A few things clear up. California does confirm identity. California is a all vote by mail state, meaning that every single registered voter in California is automatically mailed a ballot packet, and then you sign that ballot packet when you send it back, and then election officials do confirm that signature and make sure it's consistent with the signature that is on your voter registration record or is on other pieces of mail that you have sent to the election office, just because that was something that was in the news recently, and I wanted to clean that up. In terms of how the 2024 election went, I think election officials across the country were bracing for something that didn't largely manifest. It went smoothly in terms of administration. We didn't see any incidents of violence. We saw a few incendiary devices placed into mailboxes, including one in Maricopa County. I think there was one in Oregon or Washington. But that was really about it. And then we were predicting, I mean, if you had come to Maricopa County's elections facility, you would have seen that we were ready to take over New Mexico if we needed to. Like, we had the amount of like munitions and personnel and drones in the air and fencing, et cetera, et cetera. But really in the days after, it was, I guess it was the dog that didn't bark. And that was very telling because, we like to think that it was in part because of some of the efforts that we had made over the past 4 years to tell people more about election administration, how the process works. But also there's just the reality that Donald Trump won on Tuesday night, and on Wednesday afternoon, Vice President Harris gave an address conceding the race, and that really takes the oxygen out of that particular conversation. So 2024, while it had its challenges, and certainly we were nervous, was a much easier election to administer than even our 2022 midterm elections. It was much more present. We had people in tactical gear outside of a lot of our facilities, outside some of our drop boxes. We had people for whom election denialism was the centerpiece of their campaign. We had scores of lawsuits after the 2022 general or midterm elections. We didn't have a single one in Maricopa County after the 2024 election, which was something I would have bet heavily against. So it was a good election for most election administrators. It had its challenges, as I mentioned, but it's something that we certainly would have taken. Now, the question that a lot of election administrators are asking themselves are, is this a done deal? Has the country forgotten about us again? And can we just return to life as it was in, say, 2008? Or is this just something that's is baked into the system now, and it's just waiting for the right circumstances to rear up again? And should we brace for 2026? Should we make all the same mis and disinformation preparation? Should we do all the same physical security? Should we prepare for post-election litigation? And so I don't know the answer to that question. I have my suspicions, as much as I'm sure you all have your suspicions, but that's something that we're waiting to see. As far as what Amy said, I am very surprised as somebody who's been following some of the executive orders that in the first 22 orders that were issued on Inauguration Day, January 20th, none of them touched on election administration. There was an investigation launched into security personnel who had allegedly mishandled the Hunter Biden laptop story. And there have been a lot of actions at the Department of Justice regarding people who prosecuted President Trump for January 6, 2021, and people who charged the January 6 defendants with obstruction of official proceeding. They're investigating those and why those actions were brought. But there has yet to be anything like President Trump had suggested there might be, where there was just going to be a full-scale review of everyone involved in the 2020 election and whether or not the 2020 election was stolen. So I think things have been a little quieter than we imagined, which is to say they are way louder than anyone would have imagined in 2008, 2010, 2012. But they're quieter than we would have imagined for the last 3 years in terms of election administration. Election administration is an interesting combination between laws and between people. And that's something that the world has become more attuned to, who is actually administering our elections. I will tell you that by and large throughout the country, these are people who take their jobs very seriously, who don't wear their partisan sleeves on outwardly, and who just want to get the job done, and it's a lot to do, and so they get the job done. There has been a concerted effort by the Cleta Mitchells of the world, by the TPUSAs of the world, to replace the people in some of those spots. I think I was probably the most prominent example of that, maybe in 2024. And so it remains to be seen what will be happening in my jurisdiction and in some of these other spots moving forward.
A couple of follow-ups. One is, Occam's razor explanation for why things were quiet is because Trump won.
Yeah.
What do you think would have happened if Trump lost?
I hope that it would have been better than 2020, but it certainly would have been loud. I got to be honest, like, I'm a Republican, but maybe you can do a little Googling on terms of how I view some of this stuff. But when the initial results came out, like, it was a sigh of relief for the entire office, sort of thing, not knowing their politics. Like, we knew that if at 8:01, when we released the first results, if Trump was down in Arizona significantly, then we would have a lot of people outside of our facility. He was not down, and he never was down in Arizona. That was just sort of a reality that we knew, like, that's going to make our lives easier.
The other follow-up I want to ask you about is, even though there's been no executive order, there's been a lot of talk about, for example, the Trump administration not allowing CISA, which is a federal government body that's giving advice on election technology protection and homeland security, cybersecurity issues. Do you think that this, thinking about, say, the 2026 midterms, do you think it's going to be harder for state and local governments to protect elections, given what's could be coming out or not coming out of the federal government?
Yeah, I do. I think it will mostly affect smaller jurisdictions who more rely on federal aid. So Maricopa County, if it was a state, it would be the 25th biggest state. And so we had a lot of resources at our disposal that would have allowed us to operate independently of any assistance from CISA. But I'm looking at that. I'm looking at the Elections Assistance Commission, which so far no action taken there. I would say the biggest step so far would be the appointment of Harmeet Dillon to head the civil division, who is somebody we know well in Arizona, and she's no peach to election administrators throughout the country.
Although I would add, a lot of election administrators that I talked to over the last year were not happy with CISA's support this time under a Biden administration. So just a reminder that, things are nuanced, and it's not all in one direction under one administration, right?
Yeah, if you will ask election administrators throughout the country, they would tell us, so many of them would say, CISA should have done more, the DOJ should have done more to prosecute people who sent us some of these threatening messages and whatnot. And so certainly there was that sentiment there that, there will be some people who will say, well, they weren't helping us all that much anyways.
So Amy, I don't want to ask you to psychoanalyze Donald Trump, but to the extent he's not planning on running for a third term, and that is not something I think we can completely rule out based on some comments he made over the last few days, but assuming he's not running, does he actually care about this issue beyond his ego of claiming the 2020 election is stolen? Maybe one reason we didn't see an executive order on day one is because he actually wants to do things that, for his legacy, and his legacy is he has to try to prove that he thinks he didn't lose in 2020, and then it's all the other stuff he's promised, the immigration stuff and all of that. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's exactly right. I think that Trump, much like the approach that we're taking as a news organization, is focused right now on, and I don't want to say getting things done, because that's a subjective description when we don't actually know yet what the full impact is of what he's done so far. But he definitely wants to create a legacy where he can claim making good on his campaign promises. And obviously, immigration is at the top of that list, and crime, and inflation. I mean, those are the things that I think he's most focused on. And also being a strong man. I don't mean strong man in the authoritarian sense of the word, but we could talk about that too. But like being a strong face for on the international stage, I think is another one of the things that he very much wants to create as his legacy. So I do think that we're going to see something in this area. I think it's going to take some time because those other things were bigger priorities for him and maybe for Stephen Miller, and who was so busy writing half of these executive orders since the election. And the reason why is because we also know about President Trump that he doesn't let go of grudges. He absolutely sees the world in this binary way that you're either with him or against him. And So there really are lists. We know this. There are lists of his enemies, right? And in fact, I'll give you one example that is obviously of personal significance to me or professional significance to me, which is whether what Jeff Bezos is doing to rehabilitate his relationship with Donald Trump will work. Because will it work? We don't know yet. Like we have a lot of history that suggests that it might not, because people have tried to rehabilitate with Trump in the past and failed. So can I just also make two other points that
Please.
Pam reminded me of? On the what we might see happen, I forgot to mention UCLA. One of the things that I've also heard, which is the law that requires the federal government to make sure that people overseas have access to voting.
Including military members.
Correct. And what the election integrity folks want to do is make it only for military members and not include civilian people living overseas. And that is, it's really hard not to view that as a straight up partisan ploy because of their, because of the data that they have about what the partisan makeup is of people serving in the military overseas compared to people, teleworking their software engineering job from Dublin or whatever, like there's two very different political.
Does the stereotype actually fit there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I forgot to mention is that the House Republicans have reassembled their committee to investigate the committee, right? Which is the Republican committee to investigate the attack on the Capitol of January 6th. And it's not exclusively about investigating the committee that met and, held those sensational hearings in 2022, but that is its primary target.
And that got the committee and staff that got pardons from Biden on the way out the door.
Right.
Yes, we'll see how that plays out, without the names listed publicly, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to audience questions, but I have one more set of questions first for Pam, and this is about the Supreme Court in particular. So, my view was that the Supreme Court has been dismal in recent years on the protection of voting rights, but did pretty good on election integrity, for example, in 2020, when real election integrity, preventing subverting election outcomes, when they gave the back of their hand, for example, to the Texas versus Pennsylvania case, which was a completely bogus lawsuit to try and throw out the electoral college votes of 5 Republican states that Biden had won, or 4 states. And then Trump versus United States came along, the immunity case, and I thought, they don't really seem to care about the threat of election subversion. They slow-walked the case and they gave this broad grant of immunity. How confident are you in the Supreme Court protecting the basics of free and fair elections, rule of law? Maybe this brings us back to this North Carolina case that may end up there too.
Not at all.
Would you care to elaborate?
So there are some cases that are so outside the bounds of normal litigation that I think we can rely on the Supreme Court to just say, no, we're not doing this. The idea that one state would have standing to challenge how another state certifies its elections is so ludicrous that the Supreme Court is not going to go there. But I don't think that the current Supreme Court has, as Supreme Courts have had really since the 1940s, a view that part of its job is to protect the democratic process from attacks on that process. I just don't think they have that view. Certainly they don't, certainly a majority of them don't have a deep commitment to that view. And we saw this a little bit, I'll just give one kind of historical arc example, which deals with political gerrymandering. Because the problem with political gerrymandering is if you control the process, you can select the voters rather than having the voters select you. And in 1986, the Supreme Court said, this is a real constitutional problem, it's justiciable, and they came up with a rule that wasn't a great rule, but it was a rule. 2003, the Supreme Court, again, unanimously said, this is a problem, but they split 3 ways, or 5 ways, depending on how you want to count it, between justices like Justice Scalia, who said, this is a terrible problem, but it's a problem Congress needs to fix. It's non-justiciable. Justices who said, this is a problem that courts can fix, and here's an easily manageable standard, although they split 3 ways on what that easily manageable standard was. And Justice Kennedy, who said, oh, I'm troubled by this, but I just don't know what to do about it. Then you moved to Rucho in 2019, where the Supreme Court said, look, this is a terrible problem, but we can't fix it. It's non-justiciable. You're going to have to fix it some other way. Then we came to Alexander last term, Alexander against State Conference of NAACP branches, where Justice Alito wrote an opinion for the court that said not this is a constitutional problem, but it's totally legitimate for whoever's drawing the districts to have a political motivation to screw other people over. And so, that's one of the most basic aspects of democratic, of democracy is letting the people choose who's going to govern them. And the Supreme Court now, I think, has just said they're not at all really committed to doing something about that when they see blatant self-dealing and the like. So I don't feel super confident that this court is going to step in, except in cases where something is so terrible that it gives them an opportunity to say, see, we're not such bad people. And that's how I think about the Alabama Section 2 case, is, okay, Alabama has really just gone way too far here in not drawing a second majority Black district, and we're going to uphold the findings of the 3-judge district court. But I think we're going to see some interesting stuff this term in the Louisiana case.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that one too, but that's going to take us way down the weeds. Let me just stop. I have more questions, but let me open it up and see if there are any questions in the audience. Just if you have a question.
You can just cold call on people.
Dean McKenna, no.
I mean, so I think it's been hard in the last few days not to be like even more deeply cynical about like this whole project, meaning the country, but like.
I thought you meant about your program here.
You mean the democratic experiment? Yeah. You mean like the democratic experiment?
Yeah. I mean, it's not like we're even trying to do democracy, but it seemed to me like, if we're thinking about like where the litigation is coming, the question is so big because it seems very likely to me in this administration that if the form of the litigation is someone asking the court to stop the government from doing something, that the federal government will just ignore that. And they will just keep doing, or they'll find ways to subvert it, and which will ratchet it further in the direction of the kinds of orders we'll get will be when the government is itself asking the court to stop other people from doing things. And so it seems like there's a mismatch coming there by virtue of just the willingness to obey court orders.
Anyone want to opine on the administration and the rule of law?
Well, I don't know if this is directly in response to your comment, but I do think that a lot of what we're seeing happen in this absolute flurry is intentionally meant to get to the Supreme Court, right? And they're gambling that this is a very different Supreme Court that's going to do things very differently than past courts have done. I mean, like there's literally sort of a so sue me attitude inside the West Wing right now about a lot of things. I mean, you actually heard, I don't know if anybody caught Caroline Leavitt's first press briefing this morning from the press room, but it was an absolute chaos. It almost felt like a scene from the TV show The West Wing. It was like chaos and drama and calling on non-traditional news outlets and 3 people who asked questions.
Influencers, right?
3 people who asked questions today, by my count, I think, actually told her before they asked her question, "You're doing a great job. Thank you so much for being here," which is a strange dynamic. But anyway.
Fairness Week said that about us before coming here.
What'd you say?
He told me, "Great job, thanks for being here." So.
Anyway, but like the questions were this thing, like for example, the firings of the IGs. You broke the law. It says that there's a 30-day notice and there has to be a reason given, a cause in the statute. And the answer was, well, we don't believe that that's constitutional. We don't believe that that's correct. We believe that the executive branch has the power to do this. So it's just, there's a whole bring it attitude that is inevitably going to wind up in the courts.
I think some were heartened by that moment because Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham, stiffened his spine during that moment, and he said that this is disturbing to him, and he's going to be asking President Trump some questions about this notice period. And so, you know, I do think that we will continue to monitor the Senate's oversight capacity and how much it wants to be a co-equal branch of government, and we've obviously seen sort of, depending on the day, fluctuations in that.
The idea that we are dependent on Lindsey Graham's backbone is a frightening one. I mean, and, you know, J.D. Vance gave that comment before he was elected that, you know, harkened back to the famous and totally apocryphal Andrew Jackson quotation in the Trail of Tears case about the Supreme Court's made its decision, now let them enforce it. I mean, it will be very interesting to see because a lot of the orders are not orders to the White House, they're orders to people down the chain. And one question is how much those people down the chain are willing to risk their own being held in contempt and thrown into jail by a judge because they don't release the funds or the like, right? I mean, if a court orders that some funds be dispersed and the White House says, I'm not going to do it, they're not going to hold the president in contempt and put him in jail. And this goes back to Trump against the United States, which says essentially the president is totally immune from prosecution for things within the core presidential powers and presumptively immune for everything within the outer reaches of the presidency, and knows exactly where that extends to. But nobody else is. And, you know.
But they're pardonable, right?
Well, they're pardonable, but I don't know that pardons help with civil contempt, which is I'm going to put you in jail until you disperse these funds. Being told, well, if you also get indicted for criminal contempt, you'll get pardoned is not a, you know, get out of jail free card for the civil contempt.
It's a huge thing that we're watching for this whole term, is that tension between his immunity and everyone else's lack of immunity. And obviously disbursement of funds is one area, but like, you know, military action is another. Huge, right?
Yeah.
One other point on your question is just that what, I can't remember if it was Pam or Rick who brought up the fact that the Civil Rights Division is basically on ice right now. So who's going to even bring these lawsuits? Well, I mean, there are lots of outside groups that will, but one uncertainty is what the Democrats are doing right now. Like, I got an email this morning from House Democrats that they would have a response to the grant freeze tomorrow. And like, I was in an editor's meeting this morning and we were like, tomorrow? You know what I mean? Like, this stuff is happening every 15 minutes. And I haven't seen Hakeem Jeffries say much about the whole Jan 6 pardon. That was a missed opportunity by the Democrats. So, I mean, the resistance is on its heels right now and disorganized and not clear they know what their message should be.
I did see some reporting, not from the Washington Post, that Jeffrey's advice was focus on the economy and ignore everything else, which seems quite a perilous thing to do. Let me ask about, bringing it back to voting and elections a little bit. We are in a very decentralized election system compared to most other countries. To what extent can the fact that states administer elections independently protect us from anything that might happen on the federal level?
That's a good question.
I think you'll see some exploration of that, and I think the SAVE Act is one of those instances in which the vast majority of states, to be able to register, you have to attest that you are a United States citizen. You don't have to provide documented proof of citizenship. The Speaker and many within the Republican Party are looking at making that a federal law, that you have to provide documented proof of citizenship. That's the SAVE Act. That's what they're calling it, right? That's it. And so I do think there will be some of that, but I think it will go against the sort of instinctual impulses of many Republicans if the federal government tries to take over something that has been broadly delegated to the states, which is setting rules for the administration of elections. And I think it will also be cumbersome for the federal government to get down into the minutia of how many days can you have early voting. How do you verify the signature on somebody's early ballot affidavit envelope? And that just doesn't seem to literally lend itself to areas where the federal government will be effective. And so I think that you will see some attempts at broad strokes, but in terms of how elections are administered, I think that we will continue to operate under a very diverse landscape that continues to look differently in Oregon than it does in North Carolina.
I mean, one thing about this is documentary proof of citizenship, as opposed to voter ID, where 90-something% of people in the country have the IDs they need. The majority of people in this country do not have documentary proof of citizenship right now at their fingertips. When I think it's only about 42% of Americans have passports, and a majority of people haven't yet gotten real IDs.
You know what else? I was going to make the same point. Earlier, I talked about how there's a double-edged sword to some of these election administration proposals, that they could actually, make it harder for Republican voters to cast their ballots. And I think this is a really good example of that. You know who knows exactly where their documentary proof of citizenship is? New citizens. They know exactly where it is. They keep it safe. And you know who is less likely to know where theirs is or even have it is, middle-aged white couple from Iowa who are likely Republican voters. And I think that that's going to be in the calculus of the Republicans who, if they start actually talking about whether they want to push this kind of thing.
I would imagine it also correlates with age, or excuse me, with income
Yeah.
and with education level,
Yeah.
which we are also right now witnessing a potential realignment, because now if you have a bachelor's degree, you are more likely to vote for Vice President Harris. In 2012, if you had just a bachelor's degree, you were much more likely to vote for Governor Romney. And so we are seeing a shift in terms of who is a member of the Republican Party and who is a member of the Democratic Party. So maybe our sort of traditional understanding or guesses of who certain election reforms would affect might actually have a different partisan skew than they would have 10 years ago.
I think your earlier point about Republican and Democratic election officials not being happy with some federal legislation, I think a good lesson is to look back when the Pence-Kobach Commission was created, which was this, under the first Trump administration, which was supposed to look into voter fraud and voter registration. And Kobach was trying to get the voter registration records from every state. And I think it was the Mississippi Secretary of State, a Republican, who said he can go throw himself in the Gulf of Mexico. So like,
Soon to be renamed.
that's true. I think it's already been, according to Google, already been renamed. Yes.
Don't believe what you find when you Google.
But it does suggest that, that's another layer of potential pushback against federal legislation, not just that we shouldn't just look at these things through a partisan lens.
And it's also a reminder that in 2017, though it wasn't as much heralded as perhaps it would be today, President Trump launched a commission to investigate voter fraud in the 2016 election because he was convinced that he had won the popular vote as well as
In California.
as well as the Electoral College. And that sort of petered out without much of a word because they didn't find broad fraud in the 2016 election. And so this actually would not be unprecedented if he launched some sort of thing. Now, using the DOJ to do it would be different than previously. And I think that many commentators would say that takes on a much more ominous component when you have law enforcement following up with it.
His sort of proclamation about this election was that it was too big to rig. So he's not saying that there wasn't fraud. He was just saying that his side overwhelmed the vote so much, which is not even true. He doesn't have a broad mandate, contrary to what the administration talks about. It was a close election. It was 1.5 points, whatever. But anyway, too big to rig leaves room for what you're talking about, them trying to do something.
And you made the earlier point that it serves a political purpose of getting the base excited.
Right.
And it's long served that purpose.
Right.
To make
The base likes this, the base cares about this. And so, I think some people have said that President Trump's philosophy isn't one of conservatism, but is one of, I want people to like me. And so to the extent that he wants to continue to animate people at some of his rallies, election integrity is one of the, I would say, three most sort of fun issues for some of those outings. And so I don't think that it will be just 4 years without any action on that front.
Pam, I want to give you the last word and just ask you, this is a group of future lawyers or lawyers in this room. How should we think about the rule of law and the next 4 years, especially as someone who worked at the Department of Justice and now seeing the Department of Justice, the career attorneys losing their jobs and all of those students who had job offers, seeing them rescinded. Just to reflect on what this means for the rule of law.
Well, you know, this is not the only bad time we've had in the United States in which we've seen democratic backsliding and a lack of commitment to democracy. I mean, what I think we're seeing right now is the question is, are we going to allow there to be a second redemption that ends the second Reconstruction? And the way to deal with that is to fight it. And it takes a lot of effort to fight it. It takes a lot of people, both inside and outside the government, to fight it. You know, this is dangerous times. This is dangerous times, and you all are going to graduate into a very different world than those of us who graduated into the, you know, I started law school, though, the first year of the Reagan administration. And so there was already this beginning of the pendulum to swing back. But a lot of people pushed on it very hard, and we got a lot of things done. And it's worth remembering that you can get things done even in really dark times. The year I clerked at the Supreme Court was the year the Supreme Court decided Bowers against Hardwick. And the court's, a majority of the justices said, you know, we think the claim of gay people to have intimate relationships, the claim that that's constitutionally required is facetious. That's the word the court used. You know, 25 years later, we have marriage equality, which I actually think, despite rumblings around the edges, is not going away anytime soon. And so it's a reminder that, you know, if people organize, if there's a political movement and a social movement behind democracy, you can make a real difference. So I wouldn't be like totally disheartened by this. I mean, Amy points out, you know, the folks in power, the folks in Congress, the Democrats in Congress seem to be on their heels, but that's not a reason for everybody to be on their heels. It's not a reason for everybody to be on their heels.
Well, I'm going to cut this off right now because that was a slight note of not total pessimism. So please join me in thanking Pam Karlan, Amy Gardner, Stephen Richard. We'll see you for our next Safeguarding Democracy Project event soon.